It was late at night. The dim glow of the streetlights reflected off the damp pavement, flickering gently and casting an unusual stillness over the small town. The gas station where Johnny worked sat along the main road leading out of town. It was well past midnight. Traffic had thinned out, leaving only the neon lights flickering above the old convenience store sign. Johnny stretched and rubbed the back of his neck. The night shift always felt endless, but he didn't have much of a choice. In this small town, jobs weren't easy to come by. Just as he was about to pour himself a cup of coffee to stay awake, headlights swept across the station. A sleek, expensive car glided into the lot, its engine purring smoothly. Clear proof that its owner wasn't just anyone. Johnny glanced through the window, curiosity piqued. Who would be driving such a luxury car at this hour? The car door opened. A young woman around his age stepped out. Her belly was round, very round. She was pregnant. She was beautiful, but there was something unmistakable in her expression. Worry. She wore a simple yet elegant white maternity dress, with a light coat draped over her shoulders. Nothing about her appearance suggested hardship, yet her eyes held a quiet desperation. For a moment she stood still, scanning the empty parking lot. Then, as if making up her mind, she hurried toward Johnny. Johnny watched her closely, sensing that something was off. She walked quickly, but her steps were unsteady. Her breathing was short and uneven. One hand clutched a small handbag tightly. Reaching the counter, she glanced at the gas prices before turning to Johnny. "I need gas." Her voice was soft, but there was urgency in it. Johnny nodded, ready to pump the fuel. But then she hesitated before speaking again. "But I forgot my money." Johnny froze. The woman bit her lip, gripping the straps of her bag. She wasn't lying. He could see it in her face. "I really need the gas. I'm on my way home, and I can't stop for long. Can you help me?" Johnny looked at her, then at the life growing inside her. She was trying to stay calm, but her eyes betrayed her panic. A silence stretched between them. Then she blinked rapidly, took a deep breath, and struggled to hold back tears. "Please, I promise I'll pay you back. I just need enough to get home safely. Just this once." Her voice cracked with desperation. Johnny didn't ask any more questions. Without hesitation, he pulled out his wallet, took out enough cash to fill her tank, and stepped toward the pump. The woman stared at him, wide-eyed, as if she couldn't believe what was happening. "You," Johnny simply smiled and shook his head. "Go ahead and fill up." She let out a shaky breath, covering her mouth with one hand as hot tears spilled down her cheeks. Without another word, she quickly filled her tank, still in disbelief that a complete stranger had helped her without asking for anything in return. When the tank was full, she turned back to Johnny, clutching her bag tightly against her chest, her eyes glistening. "Thank you. I will never forget your kindness." Johnny gave her a small smile. "Get home safe." She nodded, then hurried back to her car and drove off into the night. Johnny watched as her car disappeared down the road, a strange feeling settling in his chest. He had no idea that this small act of kindness would change his life forever. 3 days later. Everything had been normal until Johnny was suddenly called into the office of his boss, Michael. Michael was in his 50s, with graying hair and a perpetually stern expression. The moment Johnny stepped inside, he could tell something was wrong. "Sit down." Johnny slowly lowered himself into the chair, feeling the tension in the air. On the desk, a computer screen displayed security footage from the gas station cameras. "Explain this." Michael's voice was cold, serious. Johnny glanced at the screen and instantly knew what this was about. It was the footage of him filling the woman's tank. His hands clenched slightly. He took a deep breath. "I paid for it out of my own pocket. I didn't take anything from the store." Michael scoffed. "And I'm just supposed to take your word for it?" Johnny's jaw tightened. "You can check the records. I never touched the store's money." Michael raised an eyebrow, but his expression remained skeptical. "Regardless, you broke store policy." Johnny bit his lip, trying to keep his frustration in check. "I was just trying to help someone in need. I didn't think it would be such a big deal." Michael's tone hardened. "Do you know where you work? This is a business, not a charity, If every employee did what you did, we'd be out of business in no time. Johnny inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay calm. I understand, but it was only this one time. Michael shook his head. There is no one time. I can't have my employees deciding who deserves help and who doesn't. If you do it once, you'll do it again. Johnny's fists clenched. He knew arguing wouldn't change a thing. Michael planted his hands firmly on the desk, his voice unwavering. You're fired, effective immediately. Johnny froze. Just like that, for a single act of kindness, he lost the only job keeping him afloat. Silently, he stood up, removed his store uniform, placed it neatly on the desk, and walked out of the office without another word. He had no idea that this was only the beginning of the trials that fate had in store for him. Johnny left the gas station, his worn-out shoes dragging heavily against the pavement. Before him, the evening sky was painted in hues of crimson, stretching over the rooftops of the small town. But inside him, all he saw was darkness. Losing his job was a heavy blow, but the worst part was the damage to his reputation. Johnny got fired for stealing. He took money from the gas station. Who would ever hire someone so dishonest? Whispers spread like wildfire. Accusations, judgmental glances, looks of distrust followed him everywhere. Johnny never got the chance to explain. Michael was a man of influence in town, and no one dared to question his words. So Johnny searched, door to door, shop to shop, company to company, pleading for a new job. But every answer was the same. Sorry, we're fully staffed. We need someone with a better reputation. Try somewhere else. 3 days, 1 week, 1 month. No one would take him. His savings dwindled. Meals became sparse. Then just when he was on the verge of losing all hope, Johnny was finally offered a job at the town's railway station. It was the only place willing to hire someone like him. Back-breaking labor, heavy lifting, a job no one wanted. His days were spent hauling crates, dragging cargo off train cars, muscles aching with every shift. The pay was meager, but at least it was enough to survive. Each morning began before sunrise, and his workday only ended when the last traces of daylight faded. His hands grew rough, his arms sore, but he had no other choice. And yet, he never regretted what he did that night. Every time he recalled the gratitude in the eyes of that pregnant woman, he knew kindness was never a mistake. But he couldn't help but wonder, would life ever reward him for it? 1 year passed. Johnny was still at the railway station, still trapped in the same grueling routine, still ending his nights in exhaustion on the same small bed in his rundown apartment. His life had become a cycle, a monotonous loop with no escape. Until one day a luxury car pulled up at the station. Johnny was unloading cargo from a train car, sweat dripping down his face, when a sleek black vehicle slowly rolled into the parking lot. He didn't pay much attention. Expensive cars were a rare sight in this town. Travelers passed through occasionally, but they always moved on. But this time, something felt different. The car door opened. A woman stepped out. She was dressed in an elegant gown, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. But Johnny barely noticed those details, because the moment he saw her face, he froze. It was her, the pregnant woman he had helped. A year had passed, yet Johnny recognized her instantly. But she was different now. No longer a frightened girl stranded in the night. She looked radiant, her eyes filled with warmth. But when they met his, they shimmered with something deeper, an emotion raw and overwhelming. She stepped forward and grasped his hand tightly. Do you remember me? Her voice trembled, as if too many emotions were welling up at once. Johnny was still struggling to grasp if this was real. She swallowed, then gave him a tearful smile. Because of you that night, I made it home in time to get to the hospital and give birth. Johnny still couldn't shake the disbelief. She stood there holding his hand as if afraid he would disappear. You don't know how long we've been searching for you. Johnny's eyes widened. You were looking for me? She nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. That night, in the chaos, I couldn't remember which gas station I had stopped at. All I knew was that a kind stranger had helped me when I was at my most desperate. I tried to recall everything, but I had no way of finding you. When I told my husband, he made it his mission to return to this town and search for you." Johnny was at a loss for words. She turned to the man standing beside her, her husband, a millionaire. He had been silent, watching everything unfold with quiet respect. Now he finally spoke, his voice calm yet filled with gratitude. "We went back to the gas station to find you, but by then, you were no longer working there. When we heard that you'd been fired, my wife was devastated. We kept asking around, but no one knew where you had gone." Johnny could hardly believe what he was hearing. A whole year. They had spent an entire year searching for him. Johnny never expected his kindness to be repaid. Yet here he was, standing face to face with someone he had once helped. A woman moved to tears by gratitude. Her husband spoke slowly, his voice filled with sincerity. "We owe you a debt we can never fully repay." He took a deep breath, then met Johnny's eyes. "We want to do something to thank you." Johnny stood frozen in the middle of the railway station. Before him, the young couple looked at him with nothing but appreciation. Over a year ago, he had simply helped a pregnant woman put gas in her car when she had no cash. He never imagined that one day they would return to repay his kindness. The man, James, offered Johnny an envelope with a warm smile. "We've thought long and hard about this. Consider it a small gift to help you build a better life." Johnny hesitated, not reaching for the envelope immediately. He glanced at the woman, Sophia, who was gripping her husband's hand tightly. Her voice wavered as she spoke. "If it weren't for you, I might never have made it home in time. I might never have reached the hospital in time. I might never have seen my husband again." Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked up at Johnny. "You didn't just help me that night. You saved my entire family." Johnny could hardly believe what he was hearing. With slightly trembling hands, he opened the envelope. The moment he saw what was inside, his breath hitched. A check, large enough to buy him a comfortable home. Johnny inhaled deeply, shaking his head. I can't accept this." James chuckled, shaking his head in return. "You deserve it. This isn't charity. It's our way of showing gratitude." Sophia nodded, her voice steady but full of emotion. "And that's not all. We want you to come work for my family's company." Johnny blinked, stunned. "Work? At your company?" He could barely process what he was hearing. "I'm just a laborer. I don't have any special skills." James patted Johnny's shoulder, his expression filled with encouragement. "But you have something rare. Honesty, integrity, and a heart that genuinely cares for others. That is more valuable than any skill." He smiled and added, "My company needs people like you." Sophia gave a firm nod, her voice filled with certainty. "Think of this as a chance to start fresh." Johnny looked at them for a long moment. Then he glanced down at his calloused hands. When was the last time someone had given him a real opportunity? When was the last time someone had believed in him? At that moment, he knew he had to accept. Taking a deep breath, he nodded. "I won't let you down." News of Johnny leaving town to work for a prestigious company spread quickly. No one was more shocked than Michael, the gas station owner. Michael stood in his small office, gripping the edge of his desk. His eyes were locked on the security camera footage, the same footage that had once captured Johnny helping Sophia. Back then, he had blamed Johnny. He hadn't given him a chance to explain. Without a second thought, he had fired him. And now, that same man had become an employee at a major corporation. Michael swallowed hard. He knew now he had been wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. When Johnny returned to town one last time to pack up his belongings, Michael was already waiting for him. He rushed after Johnny, slightly out of breath. "Johnny, wait!" Johnny stopped, turning to face his former boss. Michael stood before him, his face heavy with regret. "I was wrong. I misjudged you." He took a deep breath, then hesitated before continuing. "If you want, you can come back to work at the gas station. I'll even give you a raise. You can have your job back." Johnny looked at his former boss for a long moment. Then he smiled faintly and shook his head. "I can't return to a place where kindness isn't valued." Michael lowered his head, at a loss for words. Without another glance back, Johnny turned and walked away. Leaving his past behind and stepping toward the future, he had rightfully earned. Walking into the elegant office building, Johnny felt like he had stepped into another world. Just months ago, he had been hauling crates at the railway station, struggling to make ends meet. Now he was being introduced to senior executives, preparing to take on a role he had never even dared to dream of. Sophia's husband, Henry, had arranged everything. But more than that, he treated Johnny not just as a new employee, but as a friend, as someone who had once saved the most precious person in his life. Johnny was given a mid-level management position in the finance department. At first, it was overwhelming. Endless numbers, long meetings, unfamiliar business terminology. It was a completely different world from the hard labor he was used to. But Johnny refused to give up. He stayed up late reading financial reports, spent extra hours learning from colleagues, and pushed himself to adapt. He would not let his past define him, and he would not let this opportunity go to waste. As time passed, Johnny proved his worth. He possessed something rare in the business world: genuine sincerity and an innate understanding of people. He didn't just work with numbers. He cared about the people behind them. From janitors to senior executives, Johnny treated everyone with respect and kindness. This earned him both trust and admiration within the company. In just 3 years, Henry appointed him as vice president of the corporation, a position no one could have imagined for a former laborer. Now Johnny lived in a luxurious mansion, drove his own car, and had a personal assistant. But what truly set him apart was that, despite his success, he remained the same humble man, always ready to lend a helping hand. Even at the peak of his career, he never forgot where he came from. One late afternoon on his way home from the office, Johnny gazed out of the car window and spotted something familiar: the gas station where he had once worked. He signaled for the driver to pull over. Though surprised, the driver complied. Johnny rolled down the window, looking inside the station. There, an older man was pumping gas for a customer. His hair had turned gray, and he no longer carried the confident, authoritative air he once had. It was Michael, his former boss. Johnny stepped out of the car. His presence startled Michael. At first, Michael didn't recognize the well-dressed man in an expensive suit, but as their eyes met, he froze. Memories from 3 years ago flooded back, and in an instant, he understood. Lowering his head deeply, Michael spoke, his voice filled with remorse. "I was wrong. Can you ever forgive me?" Johnny stood in silence. 3 years ago, this man had fired him simply for helping a pregnant woman in need. Not only that, but Michael had also spread rumors that made it nearly impossible for Johnny to find work. But now, looking at the man before him, not a powerful boss, but someone weighed down by regret, Johnny no longer felt anger. He smiled gently but said nothing. Turning away, he stepped back into his car and signaled the driver to leave. He didn't need an apology, because the lesson had already been taught, without a single word. Johnny found peace in his stable life at the corporation, but challenges never truly disappeared. One quiet weekend afternoon, he received an invitation from Sophia and Henry to visit their home. Henry had to leave for an urgent business trip, but Sophia still wanted to welcome Johnny like family. Their mansion was grand and elegant, yet warm and filled with the joy of a happy home. As they chatted, Johnny noticed that Sophia looked unusually pale. She kept a smile on her face, but there was a subtle fatigue in her eyes. She excused herself to fetch some water from the kitchen, but the moment she stepped inside, she suddenly swayed, then collapsed. Without thinking, Johnny lunged forward, catching her before she hit the ground. His heart pounded as he saw the color drain from her face. In a panic, he grabbed his phone and called for a doctor. The doctor's voice was urgent. "She's in critical condition. You must perform CPR immediately. Don't hesitate." Without a second thought, Johnny followed the instructions. He knew he couldn't let a life slip away. But just as he leaned over to administer CPR, the front door burst open. Henry had returned. He stopped in his tracks, staring in shock at the scene before him, Johnny hovering over his wife. The air in the mansion grew unbearably tense. Henry's face darkened with fury. He stormed forward and shoved Johnny aside. "What the hell are you doing to my wife?" His voice was sharp with suspicion. Before Johnny could explain, Henry had already called for security. "Get him out of here, now!" It didn't matter that the doctor was on his way. It didn't matter that Johnny had just saved her life. Henry, blinded by anger and hurt, refused to listen. And in that moment of betrayal, he made a decision. "You're fired. I don't ever want to see you near my family again." Johnny stood in stunned silence. There was nothing more to say. With quiet resignation, he turned and left, carrying with him a sorrow too heavy to put into words. The next morning, Johnny packed his belongings. After years of struggle, after rising to the top, he had lost everything again, this time to a cruel misunderstanding. Maybe it was time to go home. Just as he stepped outside his small apartment, a luxury car screeched to a halt in front of him. Henry jumped out. His eyes, once filled with anger, were now brimming with guilt and desperation. There was no longer any trace of rage, only profound remorse. The doctor explained everything. Henry's voice trembled. "You saved my wife. If it weren't for you, I could have lost her forever." The successful man, the one who had once been blinded by jealousy and rage, now knelt before Johnny, clutching his hands tightly, his voice choked with emotion. "Please, stay with us." Johnny stood still, speechless. He had never expected this. All his life, he had simply done what he believed was right, never once thinking that it would be repaid in such a way. Sophia stepped out of the car, her eyes swollen with tears. "I'm truly grateful to you," she whispered, taking Johnny's hand in hers. "You didn't just help me once. You saved my life twice. How could we ever let you go?" Johnny gazed at them, lost in thought, not because he was angry, but because he had spent so long being doubted, misunderstood. Yet now in their eyes there was nothing but pure sincerity. After a long moment, Johnny exhaled softly and nodded. "I'll stay, but not for you. I'll stay because I know that forgiveness is the only way to move forward." The couple exchanged glances, their eyes filled with gratitude, and for the first time in a long while, a smile found its way onto Johnny's face. Life is a series of unexpected events, beyond anyone's control. Kindness is not always recognized immediately. Sometimes it even brings trouble. But one thing remains true. Time will always reveal the truth. Not everyone will see the value of kindness right away, but what truly matters is that the one who chooses to be kind never regrets it. Misunderstandings can cost us the best people in our lives, but if given the chance, we should make things right before it's too late. Regret always comes after, but the lessons it leaves behind last forever. Those who judge others too quickly often find themselves the ones who regret it the most. A small act of kindness can change someone's life in ways we could never imagine. Forgiveness is not just a gift to others, it is a gift to ourselves. Life has its own way of rewarding those who truly deserve it, and sometimes it rewards them in ways they never expected.